Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I am Safwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, and I am thrilled to welcome you to the inaugural event of the new and exciting joint book series between Columbia Global Centers and Columbia University Press. And I'm especially pleased that we are launching this series with my good friend and colleague, Jeffrey Sachs, featuring his latest book, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. I can't think of a better book or an author with a more global following to launch our new series.
Can you just talk a bit about what the last few months perhaps have taught us about this globalized world that we're living in?
How could one have a book about globalization without the pandemic being featured? It is featured just at the last moment in the preface to observe that, as the book had covered, there have been pandemics throughout history that have reshaped history. This one too will be part of reshaping history. We're living through something that is deeply consequential and of course deeply unsettling. I talk about in the book how the pathogens that came with the European conquerors to the Americas not only unfortunately, tragically destroyed native civilizations, but completely upended the world and changed the world in what's called the Columbian biological exchange. And we've had other epidemics of decisive importance in our own age, AIDS being a devastating disease and a reshaper of society as well. So we're at it again, and though there will be more in the future, I'm sorry to say, because pandemics are part of a global world. But as David noted, what took years or decades in the past for pathogens to move across continents now takes hours. And so we all watched the maps in recent weeks as how this virus reached everywhere. And it did not take long, and we're in the height of the battle right now, because it's by no means even at the middle. There still is a growing epidemic in large parts of the world. The drama is only increasing, I'm sorry to say, and the consequences will be huge.
Your book tells the story over 70,000 years of really one trajectory, which is towards deeper connections between, more people over greater areas. But there are people now who would argue, smart people who would argue, that we've reached peak globalization, right? That now, especially this pandemic, is a reminder that we need to rethink supply chains. There's talks of countries exploring sovereign internets that will be severed from, the rest of humanity. I'm wondering what you think of those arguments, and whether you think there is any going back, or whether it's only going to continue on this path towards deeper globalization.
I think they're basically wrong, short of disaster. Yes, globalization has reversed in history at some decisive moments. One can think about the end of the Western Roman Empire and the return to local villages as being a reversal of globalization. One can think about the collapse of international trade and finance in the 1930s as being a reversal of globalization. But the first one's called the Dark Ages for a reason, and the second one is called the era of the Great Depression for a reason. So we could, of course, destroy the links which make a productive world. If we do so, the costs will be extraordinarily high. The idea that interconnections can lead to adverse consequences is obvious. The pandemic is exhibit A, but the idea that you fight that by somehow closing down the interconnections of the world is a very wrong approach. You fight a pandemic by public health, not by reverting to a localized life. If we actually do go in that direction, God help us, because there are 7.8 billion people on the planet. And in a localized set of economies, a lot of those people would not survive. So if we end up closing borders, shutting down trade, shutting down finance, going into one or more cold wars, the consequences, I think, would be horrendous. One of the motivations of the book is to say, can we learn to cooperate? This is obviously not something that comes naturally, and there are enemies of cooperation. Unfortunately, the President of the United States, Exhibit A in that regard right now, deliberately trying to stoke a Cold War with China. And I don't say that casually, and I don't say that lightly. The more you know about what the US is trying to do right now, and I learn new things every day, the worse that aspect of US foreign policy actually is, because it's extremely dangerous. So David, the mere fact of our meeting right now is the new supply chains. The fact that the Columbia Global Centers will have virtual internships across the world this year is the new supply chains. The idea that the supply chains are being cut off because we look at some physical commodities misunderstands what the world economy is now. It's predominantly a service economy, and a service economy that operates across international boundaries. And the fact that the digital age makes it so remarkable what actually does transmit across international space means that only self-destruction, which could happen, but only self-destruction would mean the reversal of the interconnectedness. And when it comes to Trump, you know, I get to hear this guy every year in the UN General Assembly, and he goes and stands in the podium of the greatest institution of global decency, the UN, and he attacks globalization. And while he is a talented demagogue, the fact of the matter is that his approach and way of thinking have landed our country in an uncontrolled epidemic because other countries have controlled it, but he doesn't have the competence to control it. A depression with double-digit unemployment, a social war right now because of the racism, and a geopolitical tension unmatched in modern history. And so I don't view him with a lot of credibility. I think he's leading us on a path to disaster, and I can't wait to see him go.